Slava, Romania, what's up?
Hey, I had two questions for you. First one has to do with the development of doctrine, and the second one is kind of more the epistemological question. Um,
Sure.
first thing I was thinking about, something I found out when I was in Romania. I didn't know this before, but that bishops are not allowed to be married. I don't know if that's in every jurisdiction or if that's only in Romania, but
It's pretty common in the Orthodox world.
okay. So the reason why that kind of stumped me is because seems like that isn't something that can be stated clearly from scripture. And I'm not a Protestant, but it just seems like the if you're going to make a historical argument or whatever, seems like the original practice of the church would have been that they could be married based on the like First Timothy 3:2. So I don't know if you know where I'm getting to the objection.
Right. A lot of times the reasons for certain things happening in church history are times and circumstances. So in the ancient world, what happened was it became normative for bishops to be drawn from monasteries because the people in the monasteries didn't have a wife and kids. And so in the ancient world, it's a lot more difficult to travel around to parishes if you had a family. And so it became normative for the church to draw from the monasteries for the bishopric.
Right.
It's not totally unheard of. There have been married bishops before. I think, Peter had his wife with him. So it's apostolic to at least one of the apostles had their wives with him. But it just became something normative in the history of the church
What I don't un
due to
what I don't understand.
time and circumstance.
Sorry, yeah, what I don't understand is how that would be asymmetrical to, like, the Latin's argument for priestly celibacy, because that seems to be the critique that I hear for them is that, like, well, the
Well, that's not the only reason why that happened. Another reason that happened is because when a priest dies who doesn't have children or a wife, all the money goes to the monastery. So there was a huge profit incentive for Latin bishops to do that, to so that the money goes directly to the
I understand the
church.
criticism, but how is that asymmetrical? Like, I'm saying, why couldn't you apply the same critique? So that's kind of my first issue, and I don't really think there's, like, necessarily a good answer for that yet, but maybe I thought you would have
You
one.
mean, well, first of all, that issue is not a strictly theological and dogmatic issue. So you're talking about the Roman Catholic development of dogma. Issues
No,
of practicality, church order, and stuff like that. It's very different. That can change. The church now they could do it wrong, and our critique is the Roman Catholic Church changed it for the wrong reasons. So, but we're not antiquarians, and it's like, well, you have to do everything and have to have your church inside a house or in a catacomb or something, and you can't. As far as kind of church etiquette, practicalities, church law, and stuff like that, uh, the bishops have the authority to change that. That's not a
what is
change in
oh,
dogma
sorry.
or doctrine.
Right. Okay. So what I understand, and I've heard like Roman Catholics makes a similar argument that it's just a matter of practice that we do. It's not something that was defined dogmatically or something like that, or it's not. It's just like a
Yeah, it has to do with church law and time and place. That's why the canons are not eternal rules. They're flexible and they're applied by the bishops according to the time and according to the place. It's literally impossible, whether you're Roman Catholic or Orthodox, to strictly literally follow every canon and canon
sure,
law.
fair enough. Yeah, economia. But like, what I'm saying is the same principle seems to be at work in both cases. That it's a matter of practicality for the bishops to not be married, or because monks are perhaps more conservative or theological.
No, I'm saying it's a different motivation for why the Latins
Exactly. Yeah.
removed the right of priests to be married.
Are they completely okay? They're different motivations. You mean the
One's a
financial
good
motivation that you
motivation, and
mentioned?
one's a evil.
Good reasons
Yeah.
versus bad reasons.
Okay. Well, okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Um,
So if
and
one's
then
just practicality and good order of the church, and the other one is because I'm an evil individual and I want to get as much money as possible, do you see that those are two fundamentally different issues?
if I go along with those motivations, the problem is that depending on who you ask, they can give positive or negative motivate. I'm trying to look at it a little bit more objectively than just like,
Well, that's what Roman
I mean,
Catholics do, and they're notorious. They create a smoke screen to make you not look at what's actually going on. So yeah, I expect Roman Catholics would be like, yeah, but look at all the good reasons, and don't look over at the actual history of why we implemented this.
but okay, I guess so. The either way, it's a development, right? Would we agree with that?
It's a development in ecclesiastical structure in terms of what's normative for how you go out and make missionaries and run the churches. It's not the same thing as dogmatic development in the Roman Catholic system.
Or development of doctrine, would it not fall under the category of
No, it
development
does
of
not
doctrine?
fall into God.
No, it's not. That's why church law is not the same thing as divine revelation.
Okay. Okay, well, I guess like I guess my argument was kind of like development in any sense is objective. I mean, like that seems intuitive to
No,
me.
no, no, no. That's not. No, I mean, I think everybody admits that's why there is economia. There's going to be flexibility. But when Roman Catholics argue for the development of doctrine, it's not just something like, well, we had to, make celibate priests at this time for this reason. No, it's much more than that. It's actually Newman's thesis as to how Vatican I didn't exist in the first millennium, but the seeds of it were there, and so it can develop into the papal system.
Maybe I haven't heard a robust enough argumentation or from Roman Catholics as to why, but the arguments that I've heard have always been pretty much that, like single priests or bishops have more ability to help church like lay people and financial motivations. And so I was just looking at the symmetry. I'm like, these don't look that different, but I understand the motivations are different. So that's good enough.
And you got to put it in a different
Well,
category.
what also that's not yeah, that's also not the same thing as when Roman Catholics talk about doctrinal development, right? Like they would say that positions of theology that were never clearly held in the first millennium that can suddenly become the case in the second millennium. And I would say that that makes absolutely no sense.
I've When I hear people like Christian Wagner, people talk about a doctrinal development, I never really hear them say like it's coming out of thin air. And like maybe that's the position from
Well, why would nobody would say it's coming out of thin air? I'm talking about the Newman's idea is that in the ancient church there were the seeds of these different
right.
doctrines, and then it grows into a tree. Okay, but that's a violation of the idea of something that's a fundamental constituent component of the church, like the papacy, right? If Vatican I is not true in the first millennium, then the Vatican II church, or excuse me, if Vatican I is not true in its claims in the first millennium, then it's a fundamentally different constitution of the church in the second millennium than it is in the first millennium.
And furthermore, too, the whole sales pitch of papism is to provide clarity. Once you introduce the Newman uh, development of doctrine, well, we never know what the doctrine is because then it could always develop into. So it's
So yeah.
interesting that the sales pitch is to provide clarity, but it actually does just the opposite. Just like
I
the
That's a
fully
great
agree
individual
point.
with
we
the
have.
development of doctrine having like major problems, and like you can pretty much develop your way into believing just about anything through that principle. At least that's how
Right.
it seems to me. So
Well, I think that the development of doctrine principle is precisely how you get from Vatican I to Vatican II, right? And a lot of Roman Catholics will argue that Vatican II is the quote development of Vatican I, which was never completed. So Vatican II is like the further explanation of what was intended at Vatican I, which I think is kind of crazy. But it's funny to me when they argue that way because it just really shows the like insanity that development of doctrine literally can go into anything, like you're saying. But so, separate from that, another way to see the difference here is I don't think anybody in the first millennium would say something like the issue of, the celibacy of priests and bishops is necessarily immediately a damnable offense. So even though the Latin Church after Trullo rejected Trullo because it allowed for the continuation and promoted the continuation of married priests in the West, you still had the churches in communion for the next few centuries. So it wasn't considered a, communion severing event, even though the Eastern Church thought that it was wrong for the West to reject Trullo on that basis. But when you get to the Middle Ages, the doctrine of the papacy is a damnable doctrine. Right. So right away in Dictatus Papae, it's there, even if you dispute the status of Dictatus Papae, regardless, by the time of Unum Sanctum in the 1300s, if you don't believe in the temporal and spiritual supremacy of the Roman bishop, you're damned. So that's a way deeper, darker, harder class of stuff than, disagreeing over clerical status of married and unmarried.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah, I think I understand the logic of the Roman Catholic system, I think, and that's what was initially enticing for me. And it seems to try to get out of these epistemological problems or like objective problems. And I tend to agree with your arguments that it doesn't actually provide the clarity that it promises. This kind of ties into the epistemological question that I had. So I was just going to ask, like, part of the thing that attracted me towards orthodoxy was just the idea that, like, the church fathers, patristic writings and things like that would provide more clarity. And I know that's obviously has to be qualified and stuff. So I'm not just saying that, but um, I don't buy that the uh papacy will like provide that clarity, but at the same time, there still is the problem of like objectively pronouncing what is the teaching of the church, the unanimous teaching of the church. And when I look at history and stuff, seems like that's still an open question. So I understand that's a synodal decision, but like at some point, I don't understand quite how you get like you have to have like clear teaching at some point, right? I mean, it can't just be left open. Um, so like what is the explanation for that, or how do you arrive to that? And I think like maybe I'm stuck here, but like where is that
Well, I
explanation?
mean, what are you referring to? Because we accept the Palamite synods as the Ninth Ecumenical Council. We accept, generally speaking, the 1600s statements and definitions, Yassi, Dositheus. You have, the encyclical of the patriarchs. Like, what exactly are you referring to that's not, quote, defined that needs to be defined? I mean, I think the thing about the nine ecumenical councils is that most of what's really central to the faith is already, quote, defined. Everything in relationship to the creed is pretty much defined throughout those centuries and those councils. I'm not saying there couldn't be questions, raised later on, which is exactly what like the encyclical of the patriarchs was intended to address. But like, what exactly is the thing that's not defined that needs to be defined?
Um, I'm assuming you're not talking about current day, but you mean like open historical questions, things like that.
No, I'm asking what you mean. Like, I'm not sure what you're when you
Um,
say how do we define what thing needs to be defined? Like what?
I'm referring to the way that it's defined. Like, what's the method or the mode by which it gets defined for the Orthodox? Because it seems to
Well,
me.
because I mean, for the Orthodox, both Rome and Orthodoxy have elements of reception theory. So, for example, the Palamite synods might have been controversial and Byzantine in their day, but they have eventually been received by the entire Orthodox world, and they're even present in the liturgy in terms of, St. Gregory Palamas Sunday during Lent. So, I mean, those are indicators in the Orthodox system that the whole world has accepted them. I'm not aware of bishops or jurisdictions that reject the Palamite synods. So like for us, I don't see like what the problem is with that as an example for okay, so where's the dogmas? Well, these would count as dogmatic. Um,
It's
but
because you have
like
a different epistemology, like you said before, right? You don't have a foundationalist epistemology, and
that's
you.
part of it. Well, that's part of it as to uh like if I just say, for example, well, we have a pope in the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, but how is that actually helping to solve or define any of these dogmas when the last 70 years of papacy has actually made everything more muddled and unclear?
I
So
get,
yeah, that's what I'm saying is like we do. It's not just a different epistemology, like some philosophical conceptual scheme. It's actually a totally different idea about knowing God, experiencing God. Like it's all
well,
very
okay.
different.